We resume our study in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 25. All along, Luke has been recording events that occurred in the early church, building up to the call of Paul as an apostle, and then for the last half of the book, he's focusing on the ministry of Paul, and at some points, the action has moved very quickly. He'll summarize years in a few sentences. At other points, he slows down significantly to make sure that we get the full details of what's happened. Sometimes he gets redundant and repetitive. And we're in one of these phases of the book of Acts where Luke wants to make sure to get the detail right. And so he slows way down. We're talking about the trial of Paul. And in fact, Paul has had several trials, and before the book of Acts is over, we'll have several more. And so Luke is making sure to give us details of how Paul was treated by the legal system, by his accusers, by his judges. And the goal of all of this is so that we can see the hand of God at work. Because remember, when Paul went to the temple, the Lord spoke to him and told him, "You're going to make your case in Rome." So God has predetermined the outcome, and God has predetermined where Paul would be heard and to whom Paul would speak. But the events have to shake out the way they will to get Paul to where God wants him to go. And so Luke has told us, as a narrator, where the story is going. Now he's slowed way down to show us how Paul gets there. And so as we follow along, it can look like it's just repeating the same series of events with a different audience, with a different judge. But what Luke wants us to see is how God is at work to get Paul where he wants him to be. So let's see what Luke tells us. Where we left Paul in Acts 24, he is a prisoner at Caesarea by the sea, in the praetorium there, the temporary palace, or the regional palace of Herod. And he was under the authority of Felix. Felix had the responsibility to try him. He began a mock trial, and then he put it off in the hopes that Paul would bribe him. And Paul has been imprisoned there for 2 years, and Felix has gotten a promotion. And Felix is going to leave that post. As a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison for the next guy to deal with. And in Acts 25, the next guy shows up, Festus. And he gets right down to business. And so Paul has been awaiting a trial for 2 years, and now he finally has the opportunity to be heard. So we pick it up in verse 1. Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. He's beginning to set his administration in order, and he's visiting the major cities in his region. And so he goes, and the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul. It's been 2 years Paul's been imprisoned at Caesarea. He's not out preaching. He's not stirring anybody up. It's been 2 years, and when they have a chance to meet with their regional administrator, what they want to talk about is Paul. They still want to kill Paul. We're going to read in a moment. They haven't been content to simply silence Paul and to restrict his movement. They want to take him off this planet. They're going to say in a little while he's not fit to live. So something really animates them. There's a real anger, a resentment, rage against Paul. It's not that they don't like what he preaches and they'd like him to stop. It's that they want to personally kill him. So they immediately inform Festus against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem. Now that you're here, why don't you bring Paul here, and we'll have this trial, and let's just get this over with, because it's been 2 years, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him, which is what they did last time. So they ask Festus to bring Paul to Jerusalem under the pretext of a trial, and once again they've set an ambush to kill Paul. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea. He's in prison. He's in um, the the Praetorium. In fact, I'm headed there shortly, and let's do the trial there where Paul is. He may have been apprised of previous uh, plots to kill Paul, or maybe he just doesn't want to fool with it since he's headed there anyway. His motivations throughout all of this be, they begin very ambiguous, but it becomes clear as he goes on, and we see his interactions with Agrippa near the end of Acts 25 that he's just another political operator, and he's just attempting to make himself look good to his superiors so that he can move up like Felix did. But initially here, he's not willing to move Paul, but his answer is, I'm going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me to accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. I'm going to where he is. You send your chief priests, send your lawyers, and we'll do the trial at Caesarea. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days. Now, you see this expression sometimes in the Bible, the number 10. And you need to remember that to the Hebrew mind, this is not so much an interest in being specific as it is an expression for something that's beyond the ability to count easily, because that's how many fingers you have. So in the Old Testament, Jacob would complain against Laban, you've changed my wages 10 times. It's this idea that he stuck around quite a while. How long, we're not sure exactly. So many that you can't make it easy to count. He'd been there a while, but after a while he went down to Caesarea. He went to his regional office there, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he gets right down to work. As soon as he arrives back, he commanded Paul to be brought, and when he had come, the Jews who had come down stood about and laid on many serious complaints against Paul. They've come, they're loaded for bear. They're going to accuse Paul of all kinds of things, and the specifics aren't brought out here because they've been brought out previously by Luke as the same charges, which they could not prove. See, Luke's concern and Paul's concern is with justice. Is Paul actually a criminal? Is there any evidence that he's broken the law and should be under the punishment of the law? All the Jews have is accusations, and what Festus is going to see, which is what Felix saw earlier, was that this is really about religion. This isn't about law at all. They're using the law to punish someone who disagrees with their religion. So they came around and they accused him of all sorts of things. While he answered for himself, neither against the laws of the Jews nor against the temple. And we'll pause here to note, Festus doesn't care about the laws of the Jews or the temple. He works for Rome, and so his interest is not in how well Paul keeps the law of Moses. His interest is in how well Paul keeps the law of Caesar. And so he says, I haven't violated the law of the Jews, I haven't violated the house of God, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. I am not a lawbreaker. They accuse me without proof, but I have not violated the law at all. I submit to Caesar. I'm a good citizen. When he was talking to the Sanhedrin, his argument was, I'm a good Jew. His argument was, I'm a good Jew. I've kept the law from my youth, and when these people found me, I was quietly worshiping God, fulfilling my vow to God. I'm a law-keeping Jew. When he gets before the secular judge, his argument was, I'm a good citizen. I'm a good Roman. I've kept the law, and indeed that's true. Paul, they never even accused him of violations of the laws of Rome. He was a good citizen, as we should all be. And I would just pause here to note there is a point of civil disobedience against the state. And this was something the early believers really had to figure out because um, after the book of Acts was written, there was a movement within the government of Rome to persecute the church. And under Nero and other emperors, the worship of the church became illegal, and there was a point where they were compelled by conscience under God to disobey the government that forbade them to worship Christ. So there is a point where you say, if I have to choose between the laws of man and laws of God, I choose the law of God every time. Um, but Paul here is not at that point. He's able to obey God and Caesar right now, because Caesar so far hasn't asked anything of him that he is not allowed to do under God. But we need to bear that in mind. As I'm recording this, we're in the middle of the virus. We're beginning to reopen services, and stores are beginning to reopen, and there's been a lot of public interaction about the extent to which the government should be able to mandate your behavior. Um, and so far, the response at United and broadly speaking has been we will submit to government. Also, we're in the midst of unrest due to the death of a black man at the hands of a white police officer in Minneapolis. And cities are burning to the ground, and people are pillaging and just destroying all over America. And I just want to use this occasion to point out there's a difference between civil disobedience in the quest to obey your conscience under God and the sort of unrest and violence and destruction we're seeing all around us. And there's never a place for the people of God to destroy and to pillage and to burn and loot and kill. That is, we look at that, we abhor that, we hate that, because God desires an orderly society, civil rights based on the natural rights He gave us. So as much as we hate the injustice of what happened to begin all these protests, also we hate the abuse of uh, of mob rule that we're seeing around us. So I just want to point that out here. So Paul can stand before the judge and say, I've been a good citizen. I've obeyed the law of God and I've obeyed Caesar. And that is a model for us as well. If we love God, we should be model citizens up to the point where the government makes us choose between obedience to the state and obedience to God. And in America, we're really not there. Okay, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor. Now, immediately when he came to power, Festus looked like a good guy, and he has all along. He wants to hear this. He wants to wipe the slate clean with all these issues that Felix didn't deal with, and he's going to get right down to business. But here he is wanting to do the Jews a favor. He wouldn't bring Paul to them to be assassinated, but now he's warming up to the idea. He's warming up to the notion that if you want a peaceful administration, you better satisfy the high priest and all his cronies, because they have the ability to make it hard for you. So he speaks to Paul. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? Here we are in court. Your accusers are here. You're here. I'm here. Would you be willing to go do all of this some other place, some other time? Which is a really ridiculous question to begin with. And Paul sees that for what it is. And we'll see how he responds in verse 10. So Paul answered, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. We're already here. I'm here. My accusers are here. You're here. I'm here to be tried. I don't want to go there. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you very well know. There's no reason to send me there so we could all reconvene and hear me. Hear me now. If I'm an offender, or if I have committed anything deserving of death, I do not refuse to die. Okay, I mean, if I'm a criminal and I should be put to death, put me to death. But if there is not anything in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I will not let you hand me over to be killed by the Jews for something I didn't do. I want my rights. I am a citizen. I'm here. If you're not going to hear me here, he says, I appeal to Caesar. If you won't give me the hearing I deserve as a Roman, send me on up. So they had an appellate system where if you believed you didn't get the fair hearing you deserved, you could bump it up a notch. And so it's become evident to Paul that Festus is not going to hear him properly because he's trying to push it off to hand Paul over to the Jews. So he appeals all the way up to Caesar, all the way to Rome. And as a Roman citizen, he's got the right to do that. This is not a right Jesus would have had. Remember, he wasn't a Roman. He was in the hands of Pilate, and there was no higher appeal for Jesus. But for Paul there is, and the Lord has revealed to him that he's going to Rome, and it's becoming evident that in Caesarea he's not going to get justice. So he says, I appeal to Caesar. That's the nuclear option, because after Caesar there is no higher appeal. It's like the American Supreme Court. When they rule, it's over. It's done. There's no one to relitigate your case. And if he goes to Caesar and Caesar gives him the thumbs down, then it's off with Paul's head, and there's no other option. So as a Roman, you would put that off. You didn't want to go to Caesar because after that you have no more recourse. But it's become evident to Paul that no justice here, so he appeals. So Festus, when he conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. Fine, I'm done with you. I'm going to send you up to Caesar. But it's not quite so simple as all that. They're going to have to send Paul to Rome. They're going to have to send him, we'll find, on a ship under Roman guard. And they're not going to make a special effort to do that. They're going to wait, and they're going to put him on a boat that's headed there anyway, with soldiers that are headed there anyway. And they're going to wait for the weather to be right, and it's going to take a while. So Paul's appealed, and he's gotten his opportunity to be heard, but he's still going to have to sit in prison in Caesarea for a while. Before that, he'll begin to move that way. So he's back at the Herodium. Back at the Praetorium, and awaiting all of that. And it says that after a while, Agrippa and Bernice. Now, we're talking about King Herod Agrippa. When you're reading your Bible and you read about a Herod, that Herod could be any number of people. Herod is a family name, and there was a Herod the Great, who was the regional Jewish king under the authority of Rome over all of what is today Palestine, and I think parts of Syria as well. And when he died, the kingdom was split among his 4 sons, and sometimes you'll see them referred to as the tetrarch, which is a reference to the kingdom divided 4 ways. So over it all is Caesar, whoever the Caesar happens to be, and then under him is a Herod, a king, and then under him would be somebody like Festus, who has authority over a region, and then under him would be somebody like Pilate, who has authority over a city. So the king, who is under the authority of Caesar but over Festus, he comes with his wife Berenice to visit Festus. Festus is beginning his post, and so the boss is going to come to visit him and to set the relationship in order. And this is Herod Agrippa. There was also a Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas. There were several Herods floating around. And so to make it clear here, the name that the Luke will use is the specific Herod, but you need to know this is one of the King Herods. And he brought his wife Bernice, and when they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, asking for a judgment against him." There's a prisoner here that Felix didn't deal with, and the leaders of the Jews have a real beef with this guy, and they want me to do something about him. To them I answered, "It is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him." Now listen to the words Festus is speaking and think about to whom he's speaking. They wanted me to hand him over, and I said, "You know what? On my watch, there's going to be Roman justice. We don't do that. I want a real trial." He's talking to his boss. He's sucking up to his boss, to the king. This is a man who was willing to hand Paul over. If Paul hadn't appealed to Caesar, he would have. But when Festus talks about himself to the king, he wants to make sure the king knows he is by the book, law and order, uncorruptible, and going to do it right. So he's really just another political operative hoping to advance himself. So he's speaking to the king. He's really using Paul as an example, an opportunity to make sure the king knows Festus is going to do a good job. I'm your man for the job, and to posture and position himself with reference to his boss. So he goes on to describe for Herod the events that occurred. He said, "Therefore, when they came together, without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in." I want you to know I do my job quickly, efficiently. And he's right. He did hear him the next day, according to Luke. But he's making sure to tell this story such that he's the hero. But the story, as recounted by Festus here, does give us an early look into the gospel. So let's take a look. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed. It wasn't what I had expected that they would accuse him of, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. The real question, the real dispute, was the resurrection of Christ, which is the linchpin of the gospel. Because if Jesus isn't raised again, then anything we think we know or believe about the gospel simply falls apart. The resurrection is what validates that Jesus is the Son of God, that he has won victory over sin and death, and the only source of hope for any of us is the resurrection. So for Paul, that was key, and that was a point of argument that he had with the Sadducees on the Sanhedrin. So he says, when they came to the trial, I didn't expect them to accuse him of what they did. It was purely religious questions and about whether this man who died was alive or not. Because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. Now this is where Festus starts to fudge it a little, because Paul said he was wanting to do the Jews a favor And here he says, now this is purely it's a Jewish question, so maybe we should handle it at the temple. Um, would Paul be willing to do that? But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, this is Caesar, I commanded him to be kept until I could send him to Caesar. And I think the purpose of all that exchange was for Festus to say something about himself to Agrippa. But it aroused an interest in Paul. And so he said, I also would like to hear the man myself. Sounds like a very interesting case. I'd like to hear it. The Herod family was partially Jewish, although they had intermarried with Gentiles. And Herod, the patriarch of the family, Herod the Great, had funded the restoration of the temple. So we had the original temple built by Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians, partially rebuilt by Zerubbabel, although it was much smaller. And when people who had seen the original saw it, they wept because it just did not compare at all. And then when Herod arose to power, he wanted to win the favor of the Jews, and so he paid to build on and to renovate into what we call the third temple. So the Herod family had an interest in the things of the Jews. Genetically and historically, they had links to the Jews. A lot of the people they ruled over were Jews, but we don't have any evidence at all to believe that they worshiped the God of Israel, that they read the law, that they had any interest in being observant Jews. So here's a religious question, and he says, I would like to hear the man. And so the answer is, tomorrow you shall hear him. So now Paul is going to be heard by Herod. Now, Herod's hearing has no legal bearing because he's appealed to Caesar. He's already going up to the highest court, so Herod won't be able to reverse that. So we'll see how they set this trial up. So the next day, when Herod and Bernice had entered with great pomp, this is a big deal, the king is here to hold court, and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of this city. They've really set this affair up. At Festus's command, Paul was brought in. And Festus is going to set the tone. We won't actually hear much beginning until Acts 26. But how do they bring Paul before Agrippa when he's already appealed to Caesar? Here's how. He said, Agrippa, and all the men who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. Here I bring before you someone who doesn't even deserve to live, the enemy of all the Jews. He's really hamming up the performance. But when I found that he didn't do anything deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. Not quite true. He had no choice, because as a Roman, Paul had appealed to Caesar. Festus doesn't have the option to decline, but he's spinning it his way. I decided to send him. I don't have anything certain to write to my Lord about him. I don't know what to say when I send him. Therefore I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, Agrippa, king, so that after the examination has occurred, I might have something to write. Maybe if we examine him, you, O king, in your wisdom can figure out exactly what I should say to Caesar about why I've sent Paul. For it seems unreasonable to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. Festus wants his audience and then his king to know his greatest priority is being reasonable. So all of these events begin with Festus and his desire to elevate himself in his position. But what we really know, because of what Luke has told us, is that the Lord, through the Holy Spirit, is orchestrating these events. So now Paul gets heard by King Herod, um, and he's going to have an opportunity to bear witness, and he's almost going to be able to win King Herod to the Lord, which we will see next week in Acts 26. So be sure to tune in.